This is going to be another big one with a few missteps here and there and lots of lessons learned and takeaways. So let's just get building. So it took me a few weekends to build this project, but rather than showing it chronologically, I think it's going to be a lot easier to explain and to follow along if I break it down into sections. So I'm thinking the simplest way might be the cabinet, the doors and drawer faces, and finally the base. In reality, the first thing that I started on was the base, because that was the section that I had the most questions about. And as you can probably guess, there was a fair amount of overlap with each section too. But anyway, I guess all that's to say, hopefully I can explain everything clearly, and don't be thrown by my ever-changing wardrobe and seemingly random facial hair lengths. Anyway, in all the shots you're seeing here, I'm just breaking down my plywood pieces for the cabinet. This is all pretty straightforward, but basically it's going to consist of 7 pieces. A top, bottom, 2 sides, 2 vertical partitions, and a back panel. All of them are being made out of 3/4 inch walnut veneered plywood, except for the back, which is 1/4 inch thick. And here you can see all the dimensions. The only tips I have for cutting the plywood are 1. Whenever I'm cutting a big piece on the table saw, and I know that there's a chance I could come a little bit off the fence at some point, I like to do it in 2 passes. The first one I make about an inch or so wider than whatever it's going to need to be in the end, and then the second I cut to the final dimension when the piece is just a lot easier to handle and cut more accurately. And 2, if you have to make cuts with a circular or track saw, try to cut them with the pieces clamped together so that they come out identical. That's what I did for my top and bottom, which are way too long for the table saw. With all the pieces cut to size, I moved on to the task of covering all the plywood edges that would be visible with some hardwood edging. Personally, when I do this, I prefer to use actual strips of hardwood that I cut myself as opposed to that iron-on tape stuff. Anyhow, after I cut all of my strips and left them to glue up overnight, the next morning I could trim everything flush. I did have one little mishap while routing though, and got this sort of, runts banana sized chip out. To fix it, I cut out a little sliver of some matching wood, glued it in, and then trimmed it and sanded it flush a couple hours later. And honestly, you never even notice it was there if I didn't show it to you. I'd even probably have trouble searching for it at this point. The last and really only bit of joinery to cut into the cabinet pieces was a rabbet to accept the back panel. For the top and bottom, I used my router to cut a stopped groove. I started out in the garage, but quickly took it to the driveway to avoid the mess. Obviously, that left rounded corners, so I took a chisel to square them off. For the rabbets in the backs of the side pieces, I could cut those on the table saw, since they'd need to run the full length of the pieces. Here's a drawing that explains it if it doesn't totally make sense. Next, I moved on to the assembly. Now, like I said before, you notice that I didn't cut any joinery for the assembly. So this is going to be purely butt joints that are glued and screwed together. You could certainly do something fancier, but I just didn't feel like it needed it, I guess. A sort of running joke in the comments section and on Instagram is about how little glue I use. And while I'm never above engaging in some witty banter as it pertains to my stingy adhesive outlay, I honestly stand behind the way that I do it. Here's my stance. If you're doing something like edge gluing 2 hardwood boards, go nuts. The more the merrier. But in a situation like this, you want to avoid all the squeeze out you can. Sanding squeeze out off of veneer, you're basically just begging for trouble. Plus, you'd be amazed at how strong even a small amount of glue is. Anyhow, you can see I took things slowly, moving piece by piece through my sides and partitions. Once all 4 of those were glued to the bottom and had dried a bit, I came back and countersunk some screws into them. And then I moved on to the top. While the top was drying, I moved over to the drill press and cut out some plugs from an off-cut piece of walnut. Then back at the cabinet, I measured and marked out where my screws would go, installed them, and then used the plugs to cover them. Finally, the last thing to do to the cabinet was cut and install the back panel. I didn't actually install it until the very end of the project, but all I'll say here is that you should cut this to fit rather than shooting for a particular dimension. Basically just take a measurement off your assembled cabinet. Alright, so the cabinet was pretty easy, but here things started getting a little more tricky for me because I was trying out ideas that I had never attempted before. Here I have 2 pieces of 6/4 walnut. In this shot I'm breaking them down into what's going to become 2 doors, which will go in the left and center cubbies, and 2 drawers that will go into the right cubby. I'm taking my time here and keeping things organized so that I can attempt to get somewhat of a continuous grain from cubby to cubby. Once I had the pieces cut out and marked up, I quickly ran them over the joiner and then glued up the 2 doors. And this was one of those gluing situations where you can go nuts. And yeah, I realized that my version of going nuts is probably all relative. One of the plus sides of squeeze out though, I'll admit it, is scraping off the dried glue with a chisel. Especially when you get a really good curl going. It's oddly satisfying. With the bulk of that off, I ran my pieces through the planer, taking them down to their finished thickness, which is just a bit over 1 inch thick. And this, I think, is one of the shortcomings of the project. So here's a detailed drawing that shows the concept for the drawer and door fronts. It's essentially a triangle created by a 45-degree recess. But it also needs to have bevels so that there's something for your fingers to grab onto when you're opening them. I came up with a few different ideas for how I could create this. My first and simplest idea was to make it out of 2 pieces. A 3/4 inch piece like this, laminated onto a 1/4 inch piece like this. Anyhow, I'm not going to walk you through all the various ideas, and instead I'll just say that we landed on a version that was cut from 1 thick piece of wood. So basically, these doors are really heavy. And couple that with the fact that they're also pretty wide, and you have a lot of leverage on the hinges. It's nothing that they can't handle, but it just makes for a little bit more play than I'd like to see in a high-end piece. But anyhow, let's back up to the original problem of figuring out how to make the doors. So basically, I went out to the garage one day and just kind of started playing with ideas for a jig to let me make the cut that I needed. And it actually ended up being pretty easy. What I came up with is a sled that has a fence attached to it that lets you hold the piece at 45 degrees while the blade is tilted at 45 degrees so that you can make a compound miter bevel cut. Then I just took another piece of square plywood and screwed that down so that I can kind of hold the piece still and make it repeatable if needed. And that piece is removable so you can move it around to work with different sized drawers and doors. In the end, I'd say that it worked decently. It's pretty easy to make the cut that you want, but like you can see in this shot, it leaves your piece with a bunch of ridges because of the way that the blade is tilted. I thought about some other ideas for jigs that I might be able to use at the bandsaw so that all the material could be cleared out in 2 passes, but I'm probably not going to make this style of handle with that much frequency, so it was quicker to just sand the ridges smooth. Before I could install anything, I had to bust out some quick drawer boxes, and I used the same simple method that I almost always use. I actually have an entire video that goes over just this. I'll link it below. And instead of re-explaining it here while I build, I'd like to take a second to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Squarespace has been an awesome sponsor of mine for a little bit over a year now, and I've been using them for my website for a little bit longer than that. And honestly, I couldn't be happier with them. There's a ton of reasons I could list off, but to put it in my own words and based off of my experience, it's how easy and quick it makes it for me to build and maintain a good-looking website that I love most about them. Anytime I need to update a project or create a new page, I'm done in a matter of minutes. When I used to code my own website, it always took me way longer. There was just a ton of troubleshooting, and at the end of the day, I just didn't have the skill to make something that looked as good as what Squarespace enables me to do. So if you're thinking about making a new website, or even if you have an existing one, give them a shot. They have templates that are perfectly suited for whatever you need, be it a small business, a portfolio, or really anything. And best of all, right now you can start a free trial at squarespace.com/4eyes and save 10% off your first order when you use the offer code 4eyes at checkout. I'll throw a link in the description. All right, thanks Squarespace. Now let's get back to the build. So with my drawer boxes installed and my drawer fronts and doors rough sanded, I started to attach them. For the drawer faces, it was just a matter of temporarily clamping them to the boxes and then using a few screws from the inside to hold everything in place. Just make sure not to use long screws everywhere because you could easily end up drilling through the recessed part of the front. The doors were a little bit trickier. First I used my drill press and a Forstner bit to mortise out some circles for the hardware, and everything as far as that was concerned was pretty straightforward. But because of how thick the doors are, I couldn't install the other part of the cabinet and click them together like normal. Instead, I had to attach all of the hardware to the door, inset it into the cabinet, and then mount the hardware from inside the cabinet. And also, in order to get them to clear the vertical partitions when opening and closing, I had to adjust them to the widest hinge side gap setting. I could have cut the doors down a little bit to make the gaps even all the way around, but I think that would have looked worse, so I just settled with wider gaps on the hinge side. I've seen a decent amount of furniture with bases that are roughly this shape, and I'm sure somebody's made one out of wood, but most of what I've seen tends to be metal, and for that reason I was really weary going into this build. And I decided to go with pretty thick chunks of walnut, which ended up being a little bit over 1 3/4 inches thick. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is make yourself some templates of the various shapes that you're going to need. I designed mine to have larger radiuses, or radii, or I don't know, larger arcs anyway, so that I'd be able to use a 1/2 inch template routing bit. I'd say that the best way to... Let's take a walk. So I was editing the video and I noticed that I did a bad job at explaining templates, but as luck would have it, my buddy Sean Boyd from Sean Boyd Made This came out with a really good video today where he explains how he makes templates. So rather than putting in what I was gonna put in, I'm gonna say if you wanna learn more about templates, just go check out that video. And while you're over there, check out some of his other videos because he has some really awesome projects. All right, sorry about that. Let's get back to the video. In any case, the important thing is that you spend time on the templates, making sure that they fit together nicely, because it's just going to save you a ton of headache down the road. After I traced out 4 of each of the shape that I'd need, I used my jigsaw to very roughly cut them out. Then over at the bandsaw, I did all the cutting that was close to the line. The blade on my bandsaw is too wide to make all the inside corner arcs, so I just kind of nibbled away at things. And once I had taken that as far as I could, I attached the template to the workpiece with some double-side tape and headed over to the router. What I found out was that setting the router at a slower speed and using a spiral bit helped to make the process a little bit better. But honestly, just watching this footage gives me anxiety. This was not a fun set of cuts to make. It's just a lot of wood, and if it catches the end grain, it'll grab. What I ended up doing that helped was using 2 wood clamps that I could get a lot of grip on and kind of locking my elbows to my side at a right angle. This gave me a lot more control over the piece, and it kept my hands safely out of the way if it did grab. The real problem areas were the top and bottom of the legs. I pretty much just avoided cutting those areas altogether on the router, and then after everything was assembled, I cut them on the table saw. That honestly made it way easier, and the only drawback, if you can call it that, was that my pieces ended up being about 1/8 of an inch shorter than I had originally planned, but I can live with that. To assemble the legs, I used as many dominoes as I could fit in. So here I'm just marking up some locations and then cutting the mortises. The only other thing that I'll mention are these jigs that I made that let me apply pressure in just the right places. But since I only made 1 set of jigs, I had to glue up each of the 4 legs individually. The next day, in order to complete the leg assemblies, I made the stretchers that would tie them together. This was a pretty straightforward part of the base. Basically just cut them to width, cut them to length, and then assemble. And again, here I used 2 dominoes at each intersection. And also again here, I only had enough jigs, or jig I suppose, to glue up one corner at a time. So I had some downtime. I stole his glove. Once that was all done, I had to do a decent amount of cleanup on the base. There were a lot of little areas with chip out and, little gaps here and there and so forth. During this build, there was actually 1 week of work where every night after I got home, I spent a good 2 hours or more just sanding things by hand. I mean, I love woodworking and all, but I'll be honest, after a long day of work, I really don't look that forward to sanding. But anyway, with everything looking as good as I could get it, I put on some finish, attached the base to the cabinet, and that was that. Overall, I would say that I'm mildly pleased with the outcome of this piece. I do think that it looks really cool, but in a lot of ways, I consider it a failure. The short version goes like this. This was supposed to be a commission piece for a client. After designing it, but before building it, I noticed some things that I thought would pose problems in the execution. And then those things wound up ultimately causing problems. And at the end of the day, the fit and finish just isn't good enough for how much I was going to charge. I guess you could say I just wasn't proud of the work, and I couldn't send it out in this condition without it eating at me. And so, I failed. But I learned a lot from it. 1, moving forward, when I notice things that I think are bad about my design, I need to have the confidence to say that's not going to work, and come up with other options. And 2, and maybe most importantly, I love building furniture and coming up with new designs and challenging myself with new ideas, but I'm not a custom commissioned furniture builder, at least not anymore. By far, at this time, my priority is making content. And making content and the schedule that it demands is inherently at odds with making high-end pieces and the investment of time that demands. And I guess, if this failure has enlightened me with that knowledge, well, then it's a success. Special thanks to Derek Johnson, Robert Barnowski, Johnny Oquendo, Ben Scheib, Kevin Falkenberry, Connor Sparrow, Sherry Varney, Neil Speakman, Stephen Cole, Siege J, and the rest of my Patreon members for making these videos possible. You are the single largest source of income for me at this point. And if it weren't for you, I don't know how I'd keep this whole thing going. So from me, my family, and on behalf of all of the viewers, thank you for everything. If you want to support the show too, and learn more about Patreon, click on the link in the description to check it out. And as always, no pressure. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.